So we're going to talk a little bit about the culture of learning and development in modern marketing. So we'll talk a bit about the state of modern marketing, a bit about the state of modern marketing education, and then kind of the benefits of embracing learning and development in the marketing profession. And from my own point of view, so I'm an analyst at a company called Econsultancy, and we produce kind of best practice and research, and we also deliver lots of different kinds of training for people. But I also have a background in education. Before I worked for Econsultancy, I worked for Dublin City University for a number of years. So I'm really interested in the education side of marketing. So if I can give you one thing to think about, if you remember one thing from my presentation today, is this old chestnut here, Henry Ford. The only thing worse than training your employees and having them leave is not training them and having them stay. And this comes up over and over again as we meet some of our clients. They say, look, we haven't got the budget available to spend on training and development. And as we'll see, there's a very clear business case for kind of spending on our money on these kind of things. So let's start with examining modern marketing. If you attended my colleague Ashley Friedline's presentation earlier on today, you would have heard a bit about what we call M3, or the modern marketing model. And this is basically a model that is designed to fuse classical marketing and digital marketing. The reason being is that actually a lot of the academic models and even the professional models for marketing, they're actually quite dated. And certainly there hasn't been a new model since kind of before the mid-90s. And what has happened since then? Of course, we have the internet and ubiquitous connectivity and so on. And because my job as an analyst, I spend a lot of my time kind of identifying, analysing and evaluating different kinds of digital trends. Some of them pass by unnoticed. Some of them have the potential to impact our job, our company, and also our industry. And of course, digital has been very much one of those things over the last 20 years. And Econsultancy has been predominantly kind of focused on digital marketing and kind of helping marketers upskill around digital marketing. But increasingly now we're kind of saying, look, it's actually all marketing. There's traditional marketing and there's digital marketing, so we need to put the two together. So that's why we've come up with this modern marketing model. And while there's been this kind of fragmentation of digital channels both where we can sell to our customers but also communicate with them, that doesn't mean that we need to completely redefine marketing. So you'll notice here, we've got in this pie, so to speak, we've got 10 pieces of the pie, around 4 categories. So we've got strategy, analysis, planning and execution. And some of these things don't necessarily need to be renamed just because of digital marketing. So if we pick just a couple of these, because we don't have time to go through them all, if we start with, say, customer insight. There we go. So what used to be called market research, or some people may have called that market research, you'll have competencies in there like managing focus groups, different kinds of qualitative and quantitative research, of the pricing forms part of that. But then from a digital point of view, we have competencies around, well, what about keyword research and analytics and sentiment analysis and social media analysis and so on. And the idea around this framework for modern marketing is that these don't necessarily need to be or have to be or should be separate disciplines. That in actual fact, at the very minimum, the people who do these jobs should be on the same team. And ideally, it should be the same person. If we look at something like distribution, so if we think of kind of distribution of our kind of marketing collateral and so on, in the past we would have had outdoor advertising, which of course is now also a digital competency, PR, partner marketing, sponsorship and so on. Whereas now we have, it's not new of course, email marketing. We've got our website, we've got different kinds of aggregation channels and so on. So we need to think about managing those things together. And you'll notice 2 other very quick things here in this model. We've got customer experience. So this is something that we talk a lot about, at Econsultancy, and with this fragmentation of channels means that the time and the attention and trust that our audience has to give to our marketing messages has decreased. But our audience also has this amazing ability to publish, not just on social media, but now on these kind of aggregate review platforms like Trustpilot and Bazaar Voice and so on. So they are very much in charge or in control of the experience, and they can publish about us. So that means we need to get the experience right, and not just our marketing messages right. So that kind of expands the role of the modern marketing professional to include things like customer service, any kind of front of house activity, post purchase activities and so on. So these are things that we need to think about, and we've got data in there as well, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So we decided to do some research to examine, well, actually, how are marketers approaching some of these things? Because actually with our M3 model, we did a piece of research where we identified that actually 50% of 14,000 marketing respondents around the world say that their marketing activities between digital and traditional are not integrated. So we said, okay, well, let's dig a bit deeper into this. So we have this kind of ongoing piece of research that we call How Marketers Learn. We published a report on that about 7 or 8 months ago. It's part benchmark, part manifesto, I would say. And basically we looked at, well, how is marketing being transformed? And it turns out that actually learning is being transformed in just the same way as marketing is being transformed. By the way, I noticed some people taking pictures of the slides there. So I actually just tweeted anything that I reference in this presentation, I tweeted about 10 minutes ago. So Sean Oak 1982 on Twitter, and you'll be able to get all that stuff and not have to worry about taking pictures. So let's get into this. Turns out that as a baseline, not only are digital and classical marketing activities not integrated, but actually over half of the marketers that we survey, and this is a survey that we do every year, don't actually have a marketing related qualification. And that is despite a whole plethora of marketing related courses that are available now. Of course from universities, but then training providers like Econsultancy, and then different kinds of online courses and so on. So that is quite interesting. And then it turns out that upskilling is also a conundrum. So about 7 out of 10 marketers that we survey say that they don't really have a clear path for their own professional development. And for a profession that is being very much transformed by technology, and that's not really a good number, but maybe we don't necessarily need to be beating up individual marketers about that, because we said, okay, well, let's actually look at what responsibility does the organization have to play in this? And you'll notice that less than a third of our respondents say that their organization has a considered strategy for learning and development endorsed at the highest level. So our kind of hypothesis is organizations that do have this strategy for learning and development, they're probably much further along in managing things like marketing transformation. They're probably much better at integrating digital and traditional marketing activities. And I hate to use the word agile, but they're probably a bit more responsive to customer behavior and to their kind of local competitive environment. Laggards at the other end of the scale, they're much more likely to be overtaken or disappear completely. Now it turns out there's an issue in marketing that a lot of people say marketing is dead. And there's all these different kinds of headlines from well-respected publications. So we see here Harvard Business Review. We've even got our own pieces from Econsultancy. But look around, we've got 5,000 people here attending this event. Not only do we have all these people here, but we've got obviously Adobe, and we've got lots of other vendors and so on here. So clearly marketing isn't dead. Here we all are. But I would suggest that maybe marketing has changed a little bit. So we need to kind of reimagine this. And it turns out, if we go back, so I mentioned that I used to work in education, and Peter Drucker, very well known in business school circles, and one of his famous quotes is that a business has two and only two functions, and that's to innovate and innovation and marketing. So innovation around producing our products and services and so on, and then marketing, getting them out there both in terms of distribution and also distributing our message out there. Everything else is just a cost. Now, if we can align ourselves around that concept, then that kind of positions us as marketers as also leaders within our business. And certainly it positions us as being responsible for more than just marketing and communications, which in some organizations that is what marketing has become. So let's look at kind of the case for modern marketing learning. So if anybody attended Penny Wilson's talk from Hootsuite earlier on, you may be familiar with this image. She kind of used the exact same picture, and that is just an illustration of Moore's Law, which you've probably heard of. So Moore's Law, or Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, said about 50 years ago now, he said computing power is increasing or doubling about every 2 years and getting cheaper at the same time. In actual fact, things are getting faster than that. But then we have this challenge. So technology is changing exponentially, but organizations can only change at a certain pace. So in order to keep up, what can we do? Well, I would suggest that learning and development is how we might be able to respond to that. And by the way, actually, it's interesting walking around here and seeing all the different marketing technology vendors and listening to some of the different demonstrations and so on. The pace of change in the next 5 years is going to be even faster than it has been in the last 5 years. So that may actually sound exciting to you, or it may sound a bit stressful. That how you respond to that is up to you. But certainly looking at some of the vendors here today, we're kind of on the cusp of all sorts of new innovations around augmented reality and virtual reality, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and so on. And as marketers, we kind of need to be aware of this, because if we don't, we can quickly become incompetent, very quickly. As the eyes and ears of our business, it's up to us to have an eye on the horizon to be able to understand some of these emerging trends. And it's up to us to kind of lead and cultivate a learning culture, certainly within our own domain of marketing within our business. Now, I can't hear you, so I'm not going to ask anybody if they can recognize this game, but if you can, I applaud you. So this is one of Ireland's national games. It's called hurling. The only way I can describe it as being, it's kind of like hockey mixed with murder. It's really good. But why am I showing you a picture of like a 3,000-year-old game in the context of learning and development? Well, in case you don't recognize the man in the picture, that's Colonel Chris Hadfield. And he spoke at the Econsultancy and Marketing Week Festival of Marketing. And he said a few things that I thought were really profound. One of the things he said was, at a minimum, no matter what you are doing, you need to be competent. And of course, our challenge is, as we've seen, is that what competent means is changing incredibly quickly. So we kind of need to kind of accept this and in his words, live on the edge of our capabilities, kind of lean into the future, so to speak. So I've got 4 things that I think marketers need to focus on: digital transformation of marketing, customer experience, shortening business lifespans, and the need for personal and organizational agility. So let's have a look at some of these things. Okay, digital transformation. Okay, for reference, for people who aren't fed up hearing about digital transformation, we define it at Econsultancy as the process by which businesses organize themselves around digital touchpoints. That's fine. but that's an ongoing challenge because, as we know, touch points are increasing. These digital touch points are increasing all of the time, which means we need to know what are these different touch points, and we need to be able to evaluate them to say, are they touch points that our customer will pass through along their customer journey? So we need to be able to think about those things. And certainly if we think about marketing competencies, like in the last kind of 20 years, obviously there's been the evolution of web interfaces. So any designers in the room will know that some of those things change every couple of years. We've got, in the last couple of years, data management is a big thing. Social media marketing and social media management, mobile marketing. And then we mentioned we're on the cusp of these new competencies that we're going to need to think about. AI, Internet of Things, virtual reality, augmented reality, so on. So we need to be able to evaluate these things and think about it. Are they worth integrating or thinking about in the context of our business? So within digital transformation, obviously AI is a very hot term. You're probably tormented listening to people speaking about AI today. But the reality is it's going to permeate all aspects of marketing. My colleague Ashley Friedline spoke earlier on. He said, look, we're not going to hand everything over to machines. And he's right. And I think certainly the whole idea of AI is kind of marred in hype from sort of dystopian kind of machines are going to kill us at one end to utopian, the machines are going to do all of our work at the other end. But in reality, actually, we're going to need to work with machines or with computers to augment what we do. So you might be familiar with Garry Kasparov, famous chess grandmaster, of course, who was famously beaten by IBM's Deep Blue about 20 years ago, 21 years ago now. But instead of hating on computers, so to speak, he actually is a proponent for what he calls advanced chess. And the idea of advanced chess is where a human chess player will play with a machine against another human chess player with a machine. And they use the computers basically just to examine, well, what are the potential moves that I can make and the results of those moves and the potential moves that my competitor can make. So this is very much about kind of using machines. And when we think about AI, from a marketing point of view, we need to be able to understand, well, how can we program in some of the logic into AI? Because actually, when we talk about AI, we're really talking about a very narrow form of AI, or let's call it machine learning. In fact, most of what we hear as being called AI isn't really AI. It's just heavy number crunching. But AI, we're all marketers here. AI sounds better. How can it be used in marketing? Well, actually, the main use for it in marketing at the moment is just data analysis, because computers are very good at analyzing data at scale, far better than a human being ever could be. So simple things like subject line optimization, smart customer service, so using basic bots to help with really simple queries and freeing up people to focus on kind of higher value added activities, kind of things that we all know about on-site personalization, advertising and so on. And what can computers do? They can do the old-fashioned left brain activities, analysis, logical kind of things, but leaves the human to focus on the right brain things. Well, we know what questions to ask. We can still empathize with our customers. So it's the two things very much go hand in hand. It maybe isn't something that we need to be too intimidated about. Now, we can't mention AI, of course, without mentioning voice interfaces. At Econsultancy, we've examined a lot of the different kind of voice touch points in recent years. And we need to be able to think about kind of designing for voice. So if you're an SEO professional, you need to think about, okay, well, what about keywords and the universal search engine presence? So we've got voice is a search engine via Google Home and Amazon Alexa and so on. And we need to think about, well, what kind of keywords are people going to use? And not only what kind of keywords, but how many keywords. So if they're communicating with us via voice, they're probably going to use longer search strings. and so on. And that's where, so an SEO person will need to think about that, but then our copywriter needs to think about that as well. Well, how do we need to, what content do I need to be able to create to respond to some of those queries? And then maybe we also need to be able to think about, well, what about tone of voice and so on? Do we need to worry about the searcher's intonation? How stressed do they sound? And does that need to, do we need to think about in terms of the responses that we provide those searches and so on? From a customer service point of view, we can think about, well, what questions are people asking? And maybe that can help us in terms of creating the content around those kinds of things. Certainly from an organizational point of view, so we mentioned customer experience and user experience as part of that. So do we need to have, let's call them scrum teams, to map the customer journey, and where we have our SEO professional and our content writer and our customer service person and so on, all working together to be able to manage some of these things, as opposed to having a voice person, you know. And then we mentioned data as well. So the role of data has come up consistently today, and certainly in a number of talks that I have attended. And from a marketing point of view, we don't necessarily all need to be data scientists, but we do need to have the vocabulary to discuss data, to discuss the different types of data, to be able to discuss data management. We've got GDPR coming up in a couple of weeks, data governance and compliance and so on. And you'll notice here that in our research, 56% of marketers disagree that they have the people within their business to make sense of their data. So there's all this maniacal focus on the collection of data. We need to get really good at data, but actually we need the people to make, sorry, not just the people, but the technology to make sense of this data and get insights out of it so we can market things intelligently. Customer experience obviously gets discussed a lot at Adobe events, and if dare I provide the Econsultancy definition of customer experience. So we say that it is basically the sum of all the interactions that a customer has along their customer journey with the different touch points and their emotional response to those touch points. And that's where data comes in very handily, because actually we need to be able to understand what insights can we get from that data to try and understand the emotions of our customers. And I would suggest that understanding the emotions of our customers is probably the next kind of frontier in modern marketing. But in terms of thinking about customer experience, that takes us beyond marketing communications. And it means if we want to think about the end-to-end customer journey, there are different people involved who may not have thought of themselves as marketers or being involved in marketing before. So we've got our front of house retail staff, for example. We may have our tele center staff who are doing kind of customer service queries, project managers, compliance people, and so on. So we need to think about from an organizational design and management point of view, how do we get some of these people involved? So they're kind of questions that we need to answer. Then we mentioned shortening business lifespans. So in this era of exponential change, business models are decaying, and we don't need to talk about all of the famous kind of disruptors in the last few years. But if we take this as a heuristic, so this is a piece of research done by a guy called Richard Foster at Yale, and he identified that on the S&P 500, the average lifespan of a business in 1958, I think it was about 61 years, and the average lifespan of a business now is about 18 years. And actually, Penny Wilson from Hootsuite, she gave a similar stat earlier on. She said, in 20 years, 40% of the Fortune 500 will no longer exist. So what, you might say? What's that got to do with me? Well, I would suggest that we need to think about these things because it matters in terms of our job, what that looks like, what our profession looks like, what our business looks like, and then also the industry that we're in, what that looks like. So Keith Weed, CMO of Unilever, we got him to speak at one of our events, and he said something, he was kind of blunt, but it sort of made sense. He said, you got to tool up or get found out. And he was kind of saying, look, personal mastery is essential now to have a career in modern marketing. And we asked respondents, we said, look, when you do have access to training and development, what are the benefits of this? So we have the top three here. So improved ability to make or influence strategic decisions, ability to coordinate marketing activities, and then the ability to deliver on change programs. They're very high level, very important things. So the more people that we can have that have a real and genuine influence over that, that can think strategically about those things, that must be a good thing. Now at Econsultancy, we would suggest that, and of course we would say this, we're a training business, but this makes sense. The only mitigation against disruption or inoculation against disruption is learning and development. And for anybody who's like a CEO or something like that in the room, if you're familiar with the concept of risk, well, we can reduce that risk by training up our staff and so on. Back to the Henry Ford quote that I gave you earlier on. But most organizations have quite a reactive approach to learning and development. It's more than a benefit. It really is essential. And there's this increasing requirement for specialist skills to use some of the different tools and technologies that we have. So kind of marketing technology skills, data skills, which we mentioned. And then of course we can't forget about good old-fashioned creativity and human skills and so on. So you'll notice here that we asked organizations about how they invest in learning and development and how their business performs. And you will notice that those companies that invest in training and development perform twice as well as their peers. So normally kind of presenting a business case for learning and development can actually be quite a tricky thing to do. But if you need a stat to bring back to the office tomorrow, this is it. Now, it turns out that the technology responsible for kind of putting our profession into flux, so to speak, is also very useful to help us actually managing our learning and development. So we've got this ubiquitous connectivity that provides us with four things. We've got personalized learning journeys, access to content, access to online communities, and then opportunities for L&D. The L&D people in the room will recognize this as blended learning, but maybe the marketers in the room, we can call it multi-channel learning. That'll make sense to us. So let's take a look at some of these things. There we go. So channels from a marketing point of view, we all know that they have multiplied. But channels from a learning point of view have also multiplied. So we've got access to these kind of distributed learning channels, which provides us with these kind of personalized opportunities to create our own personalized learning pathway. So that's really good. So we've got access to MOOCs and podcasts. If anybody has a favorite podcast, feel free to tweet me. I love podcasts. Conferences, of course, we're all here. TED Talks and so on. So the implications of that from an individual point of view, we can pursue our own interests. That's great. We can start our learning at the point that most suits us, as opposed to kind of classroom learning where you kind of start where the teacher wants to start. And from an organizational point of view, while this is useful, it doesn't necessarily always align with the organization vision or departmental goals and so on. But it does mean that we need to think about, well, okay, marketers might need more opportunities and more different channels to be able to learn to suit them, so kind of the right modality of learning, the right level and so on, as opposed to some of the really bad e-learning that we all have seen and have been forced to sit through and so on in the past. Then we've got access to content. So as marketers, we're no strangers to content. There's a lot of content out there. A lot of it is rubbish. But if we think about learning, for example, learning used to be from fixed authoritative sources, teachers, schools, institutions and so on, as part of kind of fixed bodies of knowledge. And it was kind of limited actually by geographic scale, so you had to go and visit the library or visit the school and so on. But actually we don't really have that issue anymore. So that's really great. Content is everywhere. We all have our phones. We can we're watching TV and we go, what's the name of that actor again? We went to Wiki. It's like content is at our fingertips. But the implications of that is, certainly from a marketing point of view, is that we can't waste our time consuming the content and then evaluating it, or not even being in a position to evaluate it because we don't know if it's good or bad content or not, which means that people are starting to kind of pay for premium material. And from an organizational point of view, we need to think about, okay, we need our staff to have access to trustworthy material. So if you subscribe to your Gartners or your Forresters or even your Econsultancies and so on, you will understand that. But we also need to think about a strategy for measuring capabilities. So if we're giving people access to some of this material, how can we measure if somebody's getting better at their job or not, and assuring learning? We've got access to communities. So I heard somebody bashing academia a little bit earlier on, and academia just can't keep up with the pace of change, and they certainly had a point, but I'd suggest that it's not binary, it's not either or, and certainly access to academia can provide people with the theoretical knowledge that they need and the strategic awareness that they need to work in marketing. But the pace of change means that we might need access to expert practitioners, because of course the professor in the university isn't necessarily going to know how to navigate the interface of the latest marketing technology tool. So that's why we kind of need access to expert practitioners. Now, there's something we need to think about here. As marketers, we're familiar with the idea of influencers and online influencers. And some of the people who position themselves as being experts, certainly in marketing, the word guru comes to mind, aren't experts at all. And we need to be aware of that and be very careful of that when we are both consuming content and advising our colleagues to consume content. So we can access this stuff via YouTube and Quora and Reddit and so on. So implications, academia, I think is good to provide the baseline knowledge, and we'll see why in a few minutes. We need to be aware of self-proclaimed experts. And again, we need to have a methodology for measuring learning and development. And then finally, learning should be blended or multi-channel. So we actually asked marketers, we said, what approach to learning do you like best? So we asked like best as opposed to does the organization respond best from, but they responded with face-to-face. And that's really interesting, because actually it's to get out of the office and spend time with somebody and get a solid foundation with something is really good. And it turns out their second preference was kind of self-organized stuff via access to kind of journals and e-learning and so on. So we can kind of layer onto the face-to-face foundation stuff with our own independent learning. So there are implications, right? From a learning point of view, there is no one-size-fits-all to learning. Marketers that are involved in multi-channel marketing, I think it's fair to give them access to multi-channel learning. And then kind of face-to-face, if we can give our staff access to expert practitioners, they can have that kind of just-in-time learning that they might need to manage different kinds of activities. So, future of marketing, two main reasons that we need to focus on learning and development in the future of marketing. Okay, from an organizational point of view, so we already mentioned that top-performing companies are twice as likely as their peers to be investing in digital skills. That's a pretty good reason. Then we've also got things like we can manage and develop our leadership pipeline. We can encourage staff loyalty and cooperation with different colleagues and departments throughout the organization. That word again, agility, organizational agility. And it's just really good for not just for culture within the organization, but then brand consistency. So we think of all those different touch points. We want everybody to believe in the business and be aligned with the values of the business. And if we can give people access to learning and development, then they're more likely to do that. From an individual point of view, back to our friend Keith Weed again. So change is inevitable, our wisest response, as he said, is to tool up or get found out. So a couple of things he said that I thought were really insightful. He said, if you take up the commitment to learning and development, your job will get easier, you'll get promoted, and you'll earn more. That sounds pretty good to me. Now, back to our traditional versus digital marketing. So if we take a look at the bottom left here, we've got our, let's call it the laggard, okay? So this is the person who doesn't really have much competence of traditional marketing or much competence in digital marketing. Now, we would like to think that hopefully that person is just at the very start of their career. If not, they should be out of the business. Then we have our top left. So let's call this person the cowboy. So this is the digital specialist. And they're very valuable people. But they shouldn't necessarily become the CMO. And sometimes they do, but they have a limited set of competencies to bring to their role as a CMO. So that's something that we need to think about. So they need to bridge the gap. If you're that person, you need to bridge the gap between skills and strategic thinking. We have our bottom right person. Let's call this our prisoner. Chances are this could be quite a senior person in the business, schooled in old school marketing and so on, but maybe is kind of spoofing it a little bit, doesn't know as much about digital as they could or should. My colleague Ashley earlier on said maybe this person shouldn't be in a job. I prefer to give them a chance and give them access to some training. But then we've got kind of this pathway through the middle. Let's call it the superstar. This is the person who is schooled in traditional marketing, has a marketing qualification, so understands marketing 101, segmentation, targeting, positioning, the fundamentals, but then also has an understanding and a competence and competencies around digital marketing and data. Now, they don't necessarily need to be specialists in all of those things, but they absolutely need to have the language to be able to discuss those things with their peers and with their agencies and vendors and so on. Now, I'm not a neurologist, but it's fair to say I think most people are aware that our brain is kind of split into two hemispheres, and we kind of have this division of labor there in our brain the same way as we do in organizations. So we've got our left brain, which is kind of looks after kind of the logical thinking, analytical thinking, sequential thinking and so on. All very much activities that until very recently we could get rewarded for. But we need to think about, well, can those activities either be outsourced or be automated? Which means we need to start having a kind of a more whole-brained view and start thinking a bit more about right-brain thinking. Now, as marketers, we get this, but that's where we get into more design thinking, storytelling, symphonic thinking. This is something that computers cannot do. So identify relationships between seemingly separate things. That's something that humans are good at doing, but computers are not. Storytelling, that is something that marketers are very good at doing. So we need to, in this sort of conceptual age, we need to be able to bridge the two of these things. And we can't forget, we mentioned customer experience, that primitive part of the brain, the emotional brain. So in terms of how we communicate with people and manage the customer experience, but then also how we communicate with our colleagues and the culture that we want to create in our organization. And it turns out that the World Economic Forum kind of acknowledges this as well. So the most precious resource is the persistent and passionate human brain. And while yes, it is very good to focus on digital skills and competencies and so on, we absolutely need to do that. But we don't necessarily need to spend all of our time running up the down escalator and learning the next great skill. If we can focus on right brain things and think about improving our problem solving capabilities, critical thinking, creativity, and I really love number 10 here, cognitive flexibility, being curious and open to new learning. So we'll finish up in a moment. You may have heard of Amara's law, and that is that we tend to, as humans, overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, but seriously underestimate the impact of technology in the long term. So we cannot predict the future despite what any futurist might tell you. But what can we do? Well, we can spend maybe 5 or 10% of our time focusing on learning and development and thinking about, well, what might be and what could be. And if we can do that, then we might be able to inoculate ourselves against kind of disruption. And one of the things that Chris Hadfield said that I really loved was he said, always be on the lookout for the next thing that can kill you. Now, in his profession, it really was something that could kill you. But in our profession, it might just be something that's going to change our job or change our business, change our profession and so on. So we need to be kind of on the lookout for those kind of emerging trends and beware of kind of dismissing some trends as fads before we actually know that they're fads. So if I can leave you with 3 things. Cognitive flexibility, always be curious, ask questions, don't dismiss things. Always be learning, so be humble, be careful what you dismiss as a fad. And be humble, certainly depending on who is presenting you with an idea. If it's the most junior person or somebody who's not related in our business, listen to what they have to say. And then always be leading, because as marketers, I would suggest that it's up to us to lead the learning and development charge, because maybe our learning and development colleagues might not be aware of some of these trends that are on the horizon.